everybody, Joe Moore here, Psychedelics Today, coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. Today on the show, we have Jasmine Virdi. Jasmine has been writing for us for a while now. She works over with Synergetic Press, has some stuff published over at Chacruna as well, and other places. I think Jasmine's going to be with us in the psychedelic scene for a while, so stay tuned. And we're working on some more articles by her as we speak. So excited to get those up and to see what happens. So on this episode, we go all over the map, talk about kind of peyote conservation issues, and much more. Yeah, we even get into some COVID, of course. Yeah, I guess that's it for now. So thanks, Jasmine, for joining us in the show. If you want to learn about Jasmine's writing, come over to our blog. She's got a bunch of blogs there. And in our show notes here, I'm sure we'll link to a few. So I hope you all enjoy this wonderful episode with Jasmine. And anyway, I think that's it for now. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode with Jasmine Virdi, and we will see you on the other side. Here we are, everybody, Psychedelics Today. This is the first time we had the pleasure of having Jasmine Virdi on the podcast. How are you doing today, Jasmine?
Yeah, I'm doing really, really well. It's a beautiful day where I'm at, so I've been enjoying the lovely weather.
Great. And where are you located? You're in Mexico, right?
Yeah, right now I'm based in San Miguel de Allende. It's an old colonial town in the state of Guanajuato, about 4 hours north of Mexico City. So yeah, it's kind of in the center of Mexico.
Cool. Before we dig in to anything about your background, I want to mention that we've been kind of connected for a bit now. I might be coming up on 2 years, I think, maybe.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. So you do work for Synergetic Press. You've been kind of writing for us here and there. Yeah. Any other kind of affiliations that people might find familiar?
Yeah, I occasionally also write for Chacruna Institute. I also sometimes work with Cosmic Sister, doing some writing for them. And in the past, I used to write for Lucid News too.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. And all right, let's jump in. So, Jasmine, where are you from? How'd you get interested in this topic?
So I was actually born in Cyprus, which is a small island in the Mediterranean. It's directly underneath Turkey and kind of opposite Syria and Lebanon. But it's, I guess, yeah, we're part of the European Union. And my mother's father was Cypriot, but he moved to London because Cyprus was a British colony briefly. And yeah, he got a British passport that way and ended up in London. And so my mother is Cypriot Italian, and she was born in London, and my dad's Indian, born in East Africa and grew up in London, but I ended up being born in Cyprus, so I'm a real mixture.
Yeah, amazing. Cool. And how did you end up getting interested in psychedelics? Was there a certain scenario that played out for you that drew you in?
Yeah, I think for me, especially in my early teenage years, I started exploring mysticism to some degree, especially Buddhism. For me, it was actually like learning about mysticism that brought me closer to psychedelics than the other way around. And so I stumbled across this book in my cousin's garage called, I think it was The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh. And I remember like reading that book for the first time. It was like one of the biggest kind of mystical altered experiences I've had, just because I realized that, oh my goodness, like just the way that we think about things and our consciousness can change it completely. And yeah, I was also really into researching things online in my teenage years, and I stumbled across this YouTube channel called Neurosoup that was by Crystal, I forget her name, but I remember stumbling across a video of her talking about the concept of the Godhead and how LSD could help you reach the Godhead, supposedly. And I was like, well, I'm reading about these things and like drugs can make you experience this. So it kind of blew my mind. And I was just kind of interested for a long time, although I didn't have a psychedelic experience until much later. maybe, my first year or second year of university, that I was interested from an early age, you could say, maybe like 14 or something, in psychedelics.
Yeah, I don't know what happened to Neuro Soup, but they were a big topic for a while. I remember her, the video producer, being pretty influential. Yeah, and so I want to guess your first time was with mushrooms, but I really don't know. Can you tell us a little bit about that, or, as little as you want?
Yeah, I guess if one counts MDMA as a psychedelic, my first time was with MDMA. And then my first real, I guess, big trip was with mushrooms.
Great.
But yeah, the first time I tried mushrooms, I was actually at some festival. I studied in Scotland. I studied in Glasgow, and it was like some kind of festival in the Highlands. And it was the first festival I'd ever gone to. And some of the people I was with were like, oh, they want to take mushrooms. And by that point, I'd read about them so much that I had like a sense of like, oh, this is going to induce like a deep mystical experience. And actually it was quite a small dose that I took. And I think the first time I took this small dose at this festival, and I actually felt very kind of alienated and but just all around uncomfortable. And I felt kind of a sadness well up in me, just looking at people around me. I mean, what I felt like I saw was people just like taking substances to kind of escape themselves or kind of bring on some kind of state of oblivion, or no one was really like, I'm sure there were people having an amazing time, but for me, it was just like, that's what I could see in that state. And so I was like, oh, I never want to do a substance like this again. I might refrain from that statement now, but that led me to, curating a very intentional kind of psilocybin experience for myself, in which one could say I did it kind of irresponsibly because I took a very large dose kind of completely alone. I wouldn't advocate for that, but I don't think I would change it either because it's kind of like set me out on this path that I'm on.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's important to recognize. Like, a lot of us have had pretty big accidents that we wouldn't put on anybody. And they could be really helpful for us to understand. Thankfully we survived and landed fairly well. Never really something you want to advise anybody else to do.
No, definitely like inducing such a deep mystical state. And if you're not ready for it or don't have like the framework around you and the support systems to help you cope with that experience and integrate it and make sense of it, really, it can be so challenging.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, were you doing some work with Cypress UK or with Breaking Convention at all?
No, never. But yeah, when I first became interested when I first kind of like formalized my interest in psychedelics, you could say, like, it was during my time at university, and I was actually studying linguistics. So it's kind of like completely a different stream. And I had my ex-boyfriend at the time, he was studying neuroscience and very interested in neuropsychopharmacology. So I think like he brought me to a few psychedelic conferences, and it kind of opened up my, I guess, world at the time. And well, I had felt a little bit like an outsider in the psychedelic community, because I was like, well, I'm not studying psychology or neuroscience, or, like, how am I contributing to this field? But I heard that David Luke was organizing a retreat, which he organized, I think, maybe 4 consecutive years. It was called Neuromagica. And that was in Wales. And I saw this like mailing go out, and I decided to write to David Luke and ask him if I could come and volunteer at his retreat. So I think I was never really involved with Breaking Convention, but I did volunteer there. And that's how I became friends with kind of Dave and some of the people involved with Breaking Convention.
Very cool. Yeah. I didn't actually know Dave did that event in Wales. That's very cool.
Yeah, it was such a wonderful event. It was a kind of a week long. It talks about kind of shamanism and lucid dreaming and all of the cool things. I loved it.
Yeah. I imagine you had Julian Vane and Nikki Weird there, and a whole assortment of really, really interesting folks. So that's great.
Yeah, they're a great crew, definitely.
Cool. So what was next for you? Did you then start working for Synergetic Press?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, I studied linguistics, and so when I graduated, I just wanted some way to like practically apply what I'd learned, and I applied for all of these like English teaching jobs and felt so utterly kind of dissatisfied. I was like, well, this is really not what I'm like passionate about. It's not what I'm interested in. And at the time, I was just kind of Googling like internships in ethnobotany, just for fun. And I ended up stumbling upon the Institute of Ecotechnics in my Googling. And I guess, the Institute of Ecotechnics is a nonprofit that does environmental work, and they have projects all over the world. And one of their projects is Synergetic Press. So they had these scholarships for their respective projects. And so, one was like sustainable forestry in Costa Rica. Another one of them was like an art gallery in London. One was Synergetic Press. And I saw the press on there, and I was like, well, they publish books on like everything that I'm interested in, and felt very well equipped to apply for it, in the sense that I feel like a natural affinity for words and language. And so I thought, well, I'm just going to apply for this while I'm applying for all these other jobs I don't really want. And it was a scholarship to do an internship in Santa Fe, New Mexico with them. So I took a chance and I applied. They got back to me 3 days later, and before I knew it, I was in New Mexico, which felt so psychedelic by itself.
Yeah, it's an extraordinary place. I've not been to the ranch they operate out of, but I've spent some time in New Mexico, and it's beautiful.
It truly is enchanting.
Was that they call it the land of enchantment on all the license
exactly.
plates? Yeah, it's so funny.
It's their slogan.
Yeah, there's actually a substantial amount of psychedelic activity there. So you've got, peyotists, you've got 5-MeO-DMT from the toads there, though don't touch them, and there's just so much happening, from Meow Wolf to, the Taos scene, where there's a ton of Jungian analysts and New Agers. And you're not far from Sedona, which is kind of a really interesting kind of New Age mecca as well. So really interesting scene there.
Yeah, I loved it there. I'd love to go back and visit at some point.
They have possibly the largest hot air balloon festival in Albuquerque.
That's a fun fact that I didn't know.
I was driving overnight from Denver to Albuquerque, and as sun was rising, just barely, you could see everybody taking off. It was a really interesting visual. Just
I can imagine.
Beautiful desert sunrise with hundreds of balloons. Something else. Yeah. All right. Well, I think that's a good origin story.
Yeah.
And, you're now enrolled in a MSc at LF Trust. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's also another thing which, I don't know, I feel like the internship with Synergetic Press just came from kind of following my nose. And the same with this master's also. I think I'd wanted to do a master's in something related for a long time. And actually I became interested in transpersonal psychology some time back, especially through reading the works of Charlie Laughlin. If you know who he is, he was like a transpersonal dream researcher. But yeah, I stumbled across this program again because of being friends with Dave Luke, because he teaches on the program, and I just saw it kind of pop across my radar. And I was like, well, in the middle of the lockdown and at home in Cyprus, I was like, well, I should just apply and see if I get a scholarship. And boom, it happened. But I'm really enjoying it. It's like one of the courses is a module on approaches to consciousness, which I recently wrote an essay for, which was kind of exploring the notion of panpsychism and the idea, evaluating whether consciousness is a fundamental property of the universe or not. And I know you're also quite keen on philosophy, so that was fun to write.
Yeah, that must have been an interesting challenge for you. It's hard to get nice, clean definitions of what people mean when they say that word.
there's like so many versions of panpsychism. There's panpsychisms. And so it's kind of, it was a really hard write, actually, or hard thing to write, because I think, well, philosophy, you can just go so deep into it. And there's a lot of abstraction in it, which can be hard to wrap your head around and comprehend.
Yeah, it's really true. It's such a complicated topic. We're actually partnering with our friends at Dream Shadow and Peter Schwarzenegger Hughes, related to
I really like his work.
It's unbelievable. Have you read the neo-nihilism he put out a while back?
No, not yet.
Spun me
I've
for a
read
loop.
all of his stuff on panpsychism.
Good. Yeah, his neo-nihilism was something else. I think they actually even used that as kind of fodder for a Marvel comic book or something, which is super funny too.
Okay.
Anyway, we've got this conference at the University of Exeter online in a couple months. This might actually come out after that, but Philosophy of Psychedelics, University of Exeter. I think I'll be a moderator there. And
that's really exciting. Yeah, I was thinking of going. I got an email about it, so
awesome. Yeah, we're probably going to help promote it a bunch too. It looks like a really neat one. All right. So, and I don't know where to go exactly here, but I know that you had some involvement in some peyote groups. I was wondering if you could kind of speak about that from your personal experience.
Yeah, well,
I know it's a complicated topic, but
it's a complicated topic. I think, living in Mexico, there is a lot of ceremonies in general, and peyote ceremonies are one of those things. The only ceremonies that I've been to are ceremonies with like Wirarika maracames or Wirarika medicine men. But obviously, like, they're, as you would imagine, going to do ayahuasca in the Amazon, it's very like catered to Westerners in some sense. At least the ceremonies that I have been are like that, in the sense that they are, I'm sure they're resemblant of some traditional aspects, but there might be like 40 people at the ceremony or something like that. So they can just be quite big. But for me, peyote has just been one of the most healing medicines in my personal path. And so I feel very indebted to it. And I guess with its conservation status, it puts it in an interesting place, like on a personal level. And I'm sure for many people, because it's like, okay, well, this medicine has helped us so much, but at the same time, like, how can we use it in a way that's responsible to the medicine and to all the indigenous groups who are the guardians of this medicine and who have stewarded these medicines for, peyote specifically, for time immemorial.
Yeah. It's a really big conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did that piece. You wrote that piece for us, right, around peyote conservation?
Yeah, indigenous voices in peyote conservation. And in that piece, I didn't really focus on the groups here in Mexico, but there is a group called the Indigenous Peyote Conservation Initiative. I forget exactly when it was started up, but it came, I think the Native American Church in 2013 started up something called the Peyote Research Project.
Sounds right.
Yeah. And eventually that became IPCI because they realized that they needed to do something that was separate from the church and its own entity. And peyote is a plant and it has a conservation status, and it's something like beyond the body of the church itself. And so I spoke with Sandor Iron Rope, who is Lakota from the, I can't say Ogallala Sioux, is that right?
Ogallala Sioux.
Sioux, okay. Yeah. And also Dawn Davis, who is a Shoshone peyote researcher about the subject. And it's really impressive what IPCI has managed to do, obviously with like the help and funding from external bodies like River Styx, but they bought, I forget how large the piece of land is in southern Texas, but they have a piece of land which they'd like to use as their kind of ceremonial site where they can hopefully eventually get permits to cultivate and harvest their own peyote. Because as it stands now, I believe that only licensed peyoteros can harvest it. So I think the Native American Church are looking into ways that they can have more autonomy and sovereignty when it comes to their medicine.
Yeah. Right. I love this story of the IPCI. Eventually it'll be a pick one, plant two scenario. And yeah, I bet there will be far more sustainable harvest out of that plot of land. And I've heard rumor since we published that piece that they're going to be looking for more land in other states as well.
Oh, that's exciting.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Just beyond Texas. So a lot of NACs, certainly like southern United States, but there's plenty around the rest of the country too.
And I know they do have like a relationship with the Huiraca here in Mexico as well. Like there is like a coalition between them and IPCI. So I think, yeah, who knows what if they'll have a reach in Mexico too, but there is definitely like a connection there.
I don't know if you and I ever had the chance to chat about this, but I talked to one of the leaders of the IPCI, and she was saying something along the lines of the spirit of the ancestors is for them is literally inside the peyote. So peyote is an ancestor, and all of their ancestors are in the peyote as well. So this is why it's one of the reasons why it's such a political topic. Is when these things are growing outside the North America, at least, it can be kind of religiously complicated, spiritually complicated, because, you know, what does it mean that their ancestors are being kind of held hostage in a greenhouse in Vietnam or something? So, and there's a huge diversity of opinions inside these groups as well. I think there's over 50 tribal groups represented in IPCI, and the diversity is everything from very, very intense respect at the nature level, like only grow it outside in the soil. And others are like, let's build the most amazing, beautiful, like NAC sponsored greenhouses. And so like, it's not a unified voice yet inside the organization, but the organization does have a unified voice, like from that point of view to the rest of the world. So I think they're lobbying local and state governments and probably also federal governments to help transition away from this kind of really weird system where only a handful of people are kind of licensed to drive this stuff around.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also like at least one of their missions is to educate people on how to harvest sustainably. And I'm sure there are peyoteros that do a great job of harvesting sustainably, but I think there's a lot of like, black market harvesters also that are just kind of ripping this plant out of the ground.
Right. The legalities around this are really interesting. And we're even seeing some of these decriminalized nature bills actually remove peyote at the request of, Indigenous folks, First Nations folks. So it is more protected. Like this is more of an ecological move. And the way I pitch it is these people have gone through enough, gone through genocide, repression, really aggressive law enforcement actions. And they've gone through enough. Do we really need to be also stepping on their toes here? I think the answer is no. If you're from North America, United States, like the answer is probably no. Like just stick with San Pedro for now. Perhaps we can figure out some future scenario where it's okay, but I don't know that we're there yet as a kind of mass culture.
Yeah, it puts it in a strange kind of gray zone. I think for me in my personal life, I've also felt kind of like ethically conflicted of, I feel like it's a medicine that I've benefited from so much, but I'm also like questioning, well, how is it best for me to go forward in a way that I can give back to this medicine and the cultures that have stewarded it and also enabled its continual use for the Huicholes and like carried on the wisdom traditions is what I'm trying to say around it. Yeah.
I totally agree there. Yeah. This is not an easy story. And that's why I think we should just like go slow so that we have less ripples long term. Like we have less repair to do downstream.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. And actually, when I was interviewing Sandor, that's one thing that he said, like that many of these groups, and he didn't specifically say like decriminalize, but I think like culture moves so fast nowadays, and like going slow is the key to we need to move at the pace of nature in order to align ourselves with its values.
Yeah. Yeah. What's the phrase? Slow is smooth is a new pop term that's coming up.
Okay. Slow is smooth.
Slow is smooth. Yeah. So I would love to chat about COVID for a bit. You wrote an interesting piece for Chacruna recently about COVID and kind of ayahuasca communities.
Yeah. It was a series of pieces, actually. So there were 3 pieces. One was looking at ayahuasca groups in Brazil, so mostly ayahuasca churches in Brazil. I think in that one, I mostly looked at the Santo Daime and how they've responded to the COVID crisis. And then another one was about facilitators in North America. And the other one was about indigenous groups in, Brazil and also Ecuador. And I think, on the one side, like many people were kind of, I hadn't initially planned on it being 3 pieces, but as I started to talk to people, especially like facilitators from North America, they were just like, well, our story isn't really what's interesting in some sense, because they were more concerned about like what is going on in the Amazon. But at least with facilitators in North America, I think some of the more interesting things have been like that some people are switching from like hosting ayahuasca ceremonies to facilitating 5-MeO-DMT ceremonies, for example, because they are less contaminating, so to speak, in the person. There's less probability of the person throwing up. They're much quicker. They're more like one-on-one as opposed to in a group setting. And so that's one of the interesting trends that I discovered. But also, I guess a lot of the people are trying to find creative ways of subsidizing their church or their ayahuasca community, whether it's like finding kind of scholarships for people that can no longer afford to come and still like want to, and obviously are in need of like the medicine. Yeah, I'm trying to think, what did other groups do? But I think actually a general trend among facilitators is that they had noticed like throughout COVID, they actually felt the demand for ayahuasca ceremonies increasing as opposed to decreasing.
Wow.
So there were more people that were interested in doing ceremonies and that wanted to be involved. And I think it kind of speaks to the fact that, well, the world is in dire need of healing. And also maybe people are connected with a sense of like, oh, what they really value and want to move forward to or forward towards when they're kind of confronted with their own mortality. Like building community is now more important than ever. And I think a lot of people find community in plant medicine circles.
Yeah. Talk about a difficult balance, right? Like people are dying at an alarming rate. People are committing suicide at a pretty aggressive rate. So there's a lot of social harm happening. And like the one thing that could pull us out is community. And we don't really have many great options for in-person community. And it's like,
it's especially hard.
Right. It's like talking to your friends on the phone, or you get to go to a 20 to 80 person ayahuasca workshop and you get to commune with all these people at great risk to them, their friends and family, and yours. So it's like, what is the best choice? That's why we kind of lean towards this more one-on-one deal with 5-MeO or ketamine. We more lean towards ketamine now because it's like in a controlled clinical environment where typically there's good medical precautions happening. Yeah. Versus other places where it's like mask optional, which to me seems really troubling.
But I also think like there's an undercurrent within the plant medicine community in which like there is this kind of belief that, taking these plant medicines will kind of fertilize our immune systems. So I've seen people going to take kambo or ayahuasca or, rapé, all with the intention of like, well, this will kind of like protect me against COVID. This medicine is so strong that it will clean me out of all of these like negative energies, and also kind of infectious diseases, not diseases, what am I saying, but infections generally.
Right.
So I think that's an interesting belief system that not everyone holds, but I have definitely noticed that there is a belief that, okay, well, we're just going to actually take plant medicine because of these reasons. And actually, speaking to someone who is a santo daime, like padrino or priest, he told me that in Brazil nowadays there is more ayahuasca microdosing being advertised on the internet. And like part of the reason that these microdoses are being advertised is because like ayahuasca can supposedly like be good for your immune system and rid you of COVID.
Right.
So it's becoming more popular to microdose it for that reason too.
Right. And I guess the contrast is like Brazil being kind of up there with the United States and being like real anti-heroes in this COVID battle. Yeah. So go ahead.
But also like in the piece that I wrote looking at indigenous groups, some indigenous groups have kind of gone back to using more traditional medicines and including ayahuasca to treat COVID. But I mean, COVID cases had fallen at the time, like I was researching this as a result of them doing that, but it's unclear whether they had fallen because these groups had become more isolated again, if that makes sense, or because of these alternative medicines they'd been taking. So yeah, there's a correlation maybe, but there's other factors.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's other factors that like are unaccounted for, or that you simply, it's hard to draw conclusions from it.
Right. The science isn't really out yet. And like, you know, on this, like I totally get the antimicrobial part and the antiviral part on ayahuasca. It's just, we don't have great data. And on the other angle, like the spiritual angle, like if this thing was here to protect certain human groups, perhaps those users of ayahuasca wouldn't have been as harmed by colonization and genocide. Like that's a pretty typical talk track for me. It's a little dark, but
yeah, definitely.
It's kind of something we should think about. If the spirit of this thing is here to protect us, did it protect the people before? And the answer is kind of not as well. We got to cut these things down to different perspectives, right? Because the belief systems are so complex.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's a really, really complicated subject, but
well, we've got to approach it to break down these complicating factors so we can kind of figure out the best way through.
Yeah, I think I would just like advocate staying away from big ceremonies for the time being.
Right.
Well,
like I think the number I personally came up with was about 5 people, though that's still pretty problematic because you could have a lot of exposure and a lot of distribution. Personally, having dealt with a lot of fallout from what they're calling COVID long hauler, like it's, it's not just dying. Like this stuff can hurt every system in your body, apparently. Pulmonary, cardiac, liver, all of it. So it's hard to predict. It's kind of like a lightning strike. So you're rolling the dice and you're rolling the dice for other people too. So yeah, I agree, Jasmine.
Yeah,
like,
I think that's the biggest thing.
Let's go slow.
It's like you might not mind taking risks, but actually when you think about it on a bigger scale, it's like you're not the only one taking the risk.
Right. It's like drunk driving.
Yep, exactly.
Right. You're making decisions about somebody else's life without consent. Yeah. And that's the biggest deal. So this, by the time this comes out, hopefully majority of our listeners have a vaccine, but
fingers crossed.
Yeah, right. I'm trying to find some black market sources. Nah, our town just bought a lot, so I might be able to get one in a few weeks, maybe. So yeah, COVID. These smaller ceremonies, it's a big deal. Like, and I appreciate your angle there with like 5-MeO. Like, as kind of creeped out as I am by like the 5-MeO world in the underground.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's better. It seems a little culty.
Yeah, as a medicine, it doesn't call to me in that the times I have experienced 5-MeO, it's just been kind of like complete dissolution, alien. Well, no, not maybe aliens with 5-MeO, but just ecstatic Godhead, gold light, but then I come back down. I find that them really hard to integrate. That's the thing. So I tend to kind of avoid those very like shot into hyperspace and back.
Right.
Yeah.
It's like so exotic that it's so attractive, but is it really like, are we there yet? Like there's known harmful facilitators. There's known kind of really unsafe behavior generally in the scene. Like there's definitely people doing it right. Like, don't get me wrong, but
yeah, I agree.
if people are having a hard time integrating like a mushroom experience, like how severe might the 5-MeO integration problem be?
Yeah, especially because it coming out of that state, at least for me, the times I have experienced like smokable, like NN dimethyltryptamine and 5-MeO, it's just been kind of like so rapid that it feels like some hazy dream by the time I'm back that I can barely kind of grasp and move through. Mm-hmm. But actually, I did watch an episode of Hamilton's Pharmacopeia recently, and the one about the Bufo alvarius. It's like another thing which is being like driven to extinction. And I think well, maybe not extinction, but yeah,
close
another
to it.
thing which we need to fight to conserve. And I guess it puts us all in like a weird kind of ethical place in the psychedelic community and the psychedelic renaissance more generally. It's like, okay, well, we're benefiting so much from these medicines, but really how can we move forward in an integral way?
Yeah. Yeah. And like Hamilton's really thankfully pushing now for the synthetic version. Mm-hmm. So when Vice published his first episode, it seemed as though they totally missed the ecological angle. Mm-hmm. I was in conversation with like ecologist from Tucson, Arizona, who's been studying these toads for a long time. And the populations are absolutely going down in his observation. He said that they had a lot of film about the ecological stuff, but Vice instead, chose not to publish that and instead published stuff with Dr. Jerry Sandoval, who's got quite the negative reputation now.
Okay. And that was the one in season 2, the earlier episode, right?
I believe so. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I haven't seen that one yet, so
it's worth seeing. Especially now that like Dr. Jerry Sandoval's like got a pretty shady backstory. And for those who don't know, check out 5-MeO-DMT-malpractice.org. There's a lot of hyphens in there, so just Google it. Mm-hmm. But it lists like a letter by an organization that just wanted to get this information out there. Yeah, I don't really want to get into it here, but it's worth checking out. So Vice, I think Hamilton kind of strong-armed Vice, thank God, and got that stuff back in. Because, like Mike Tyson is now popularizing 5-MeO-DMT, which is kind of a nightmare to me, but convicted rapist with psychedelics now. It's like, great. Perfect. And he's quite the popular individual. He's making quite the media comeback somehow. So like him and people like Tony Robbins, I think, who smoked with Mike Tyson, like they could really tilt the scales towards these things, like these toads getting really over-harvested. Yeah. We've done a bunch of episodes on that in the past, so people can go check out 5-MeO, Sonoran Desert Toads episodes in our backlog. Mm-hmm. You've not used it yet, right?
I've had synthetic 5-MeO-DMT some years ago now. I've never actually had the toad, even though I've had plenty of opportunities actually. But as I said to you, I just don't feel like it's something for me in a way. Yeah, I tend to stick to I guess psilocybin. Yeah
as much as we don't know what we're going to get, we kind of do also. It's a really important thing. And not to mention, you're not having to deal with wild chemists or black market toad people who in Mexico at times have quite the cartel affiliation. So something.
Yeah, I don't really know much about the black market of toads, but I can imagine there is one. Yeah,
it's brutal. Especially in the more poor rural areas. I think we've covered that a few times in the podcast. It's like people will go around these areas where there's lights at night and they'll just like fill up buckets with toads and then bring them kind of miles from home and either just kill all the toads or just like kind of leave them out, and they don't know how to get home. So they're kind of defenseless and you kind of milked their secretions. So like they can't even defend themselves if they needed to with their natural defenses. Not like they're a very scary animal anyway, but yeah, they just can't get home and they die. And populations are going down from that. There's a lot of like road kill from lights being next to roads. I think there's some global warming stuff around like atmosphere issues and UV radiation impacting them. So it's a multifactorial thing. It's not just the markets, but the markets definitely play a significant role there.
Yeah, I mean, facing threats on multiple sides, I think the least we can do is kind of back off on one of them, and find ways to conserve them.
Right. Yeah. Like the slow is smooth concept, I think, is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Slow and smooth.
Yeah. So have you been interested in any other major psychedelic topics lately around the whole culture scene?
Something that's been interesting me lately is psychedelics and autism. It's something
Have you been in touch with Aaron?
Yes, I have. I'm going to speak to him on Monday.
Great.
But yes, that's something actually that has interested me for a long time, because when I first, maybe in 2013, shortly after I had my first mushroom experience, a friend of mine had used psychedelics because he had read, I think, some preliminary studies of Alicia Danforth's and about how it could reduce social anxiety and things like that and help people with autism. And he was autistic. And so I was really close to him, and it really helped him along his personal healing journey. And so it's something to some extent, which is quite dear to me because of my friendship with him. But it's a topic that I haven't picked up in a while. And I think since then, there's been a lot more movement, at least in that community, and people speaking about it. And I'd like to pick up that thread again.
Yeah, great. It seems like Aaron Orsini's really picking up heat.
Yeah,
on this
definitely.
Topic. Yeah, I think we've had him on once or twice. I definitely had a few phone calls with him to help advise him on his direction. And as I was approaching the topic, I was so thankful for Alicia Danforth giving me some support around how to talk about this topic, because this idea of autistic spectrum disorder, and then this idea of neurodivergent and neurotypical became a really interesting philosophical topic. It's what is neurotypical? How neurodivergent are people across the board? I think there's a lot more neurodivergence than we understand, right?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And I think, we just have all these conventional ways of behaving. And so we all put on these kind of, polite, we're just polite, and we have these social kind of codes that we behave by. But it doesn't mean that if we were in another context that those wouldn't make sense.
Right. Yeah. So I guess let's talk about that. So Alicia Danforth and others, maybe Charlie Grove and UCLA, the study was around alleviating social anxiety in adults with diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder. And they saw substantial alleviation of social anxiety, from what I recall. One of the bigger notices in all of autism research, ASD research. And I think it was MDMA, if I'm not mistaken. Aaron Orsini's story is interesting because it was just a one time with acid. He was like, wait, what? Is this what neurotypical folks feel like? And then just kind of kept going.
He describes kind of smiling at someone or looking at someone in the eye and just feeling kind of a connection with that person, right?
Yeah, exactly. This is what empathy feels like. Just a really cool concept and path he's gone down.
Yeah, it's so beautiful to me how psychedelics and plant medicines just have the potential to help so many different communities in so many different ways. I think there's definitely a lot of overlap. But I remember just very recently, actually, I was talking to a friend about this topic because it's something that I'm interested in writing about. And he's like, well, I mean, who aren't psychedelics good for, or what aren't they good for? And it's funny that we're having to ask that question. There are cases where I'd say advocate against using them, of course, but they're just really promising in the field of mental health. And I also feel that on a transpersonal level, they have so much to offer to like humanity, in the sense that, yeah, we can feel that there's something wrong with the way that we're living. Like, we've mentioned conservation like several times over the span of this conversation. And there's this kind of like looming threat of like extinguishing ourselves. And so for me, I would say, like, philosophically, I lean towards like post-materialist ways of viewing the world. And yeah, for me, it's a question of like our metaphysical beliefs, or our lack thereof of them. And I feel psychedelics are kind of like ontologically kind of revolutionary to some extent, because they can put us back in touch with the numinous and the mystical, and open ourselves back to that side.
Right. And imagination, and creativity.
Imagination, exactly.
Like, if our imaginations are amazing, how much material stuff do we really need in terms of like buying a new car every year, all this kind of gross kind of first world behavior? Yeah. And how do we revision this? How do we go forward? I had this environmental activist many years ago. I was helping her with all sorts of stuff related to transition towns, which is like, how does a town transition away from oil and the mainstream? So I was helping her a bunch with that stuff. And one of her lines to me, and it was like a terrifying and earth-shattering line, and I'm still kind of reeling from it. It was like, the best thing environmentally an American can do, and this is Americans, so let's not universalize this, is to not have a child. And that was like, I was 24, 25 or something when I was getting these downloads. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like really feeling the ecological crisis. And then somebody tells me something like that. And it's quite the human impulse to procreate. And now that the world has put us in this physical condition, this position, is the ethical move to not procreate. And what does that do psychologically? Like, you've got your kind of your biological impulse, and then your intellect kind of constraining that. It's kind of like perfect storm for creating neurosis.
I don't know.
It's kind of a strange deal.
I agree with you. And like, I think for me, actually, like, I can very much respect that people don't want to have children, that these are choices that people make. But I think like there's a sense of like heartbreak in me that there is like a shaming sometimes of people who do have children or want to. It's like, okay, well, it's a selfish thing to want to do, to have a child, because you're not thinking about the rest of the planet. And actually, I forget what the movie is called. Is it Children of Men? I watched that some years ago, and it's a plot about like people in the world can no longer have children, you know, and like,
and they're like protecting the pregnant woman.
Yeah, exactly. And I just remember like
that was terrifying,
watching that movie and just feeling absolutely like, I don't know, it made me feel actually kind of depressed for a while. And just thinking about this childless world, I was like, well, what really then is there to live for? But this is just my personal view, because I love children so much and they bring me so much hope and joy. And but I feel like if there's like no future to humanity, like what are we stewarding? What are we pushing forward?
Right. And this conversation, I think, is why the ecological situation is so concerning. Yeah. Like Jimi Hendrix, I think, at Woodstock, essentially put the blame on the establishment. Like, you've created a world where we don't want to reproduce anymore, and shame on you for creating a world that's this vile and dangerous and scary. And I could really feel that from him. Yeah. I wish I had the direct quote, but this has been a topic in the psychedelic world for a long time. Yeah.
I guess it's something that I have been interested in, especially like writing this essay on panpsychism, is just like, what are like the philosophical undercurrents that kind of leak out into our worldviews? And for me, materialism as a belief system, this is my personal opinion, but it falls short, because if there is the view that matter is dead and inanimate, then what does it matter that what we do with it or how we treat it? I really love the thinking of David Abram. He's a philosopher and ecologist. I think he's based in New Mexico, actually. But he wrote this wonderful book in the 90s called The Spell of the Sensuous. And it's about how having a written language and an alphabet has like abstracted our sense of self from nature. And essentially we've kind of fallen in love with logos. So yeah, I'm really fascinated by the philosophical undercurrents of like the ecological situation.
And you've been in conversation with Sam Gandy, who's been doing some discussions on this. Does he have anything about kind of like, future generations and like, or where's his focus?
To be honest, I'm meant to be in conversation with him. I haven't gotten around to having that talk yet.
No,
so something's still pending, but I'd be interested to ask him what he thinks.
Cool. Yeah, I think that would be neat. And hopefully we get to do a written piece on that in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, this ecological thing is so crazy because it's kind of like COVID. Like not everybody believes in the ecological crisis or that species are going extinct at a blinding pace on account of human interaction.
It's kind of crazy how we can get to like a level, but there's so much kind of cognitive dissonance. It's like, oh, there are so many people dying around the world, but you just kind of like choose to dissociate. And the same with like the ecological crisis. It's kind of something like blatantly in front of our own eyes that it's hard to avoid, but we still manage to.
Right. Terence McKenna had the phrase, the balkanization of epistemology. And it's just like everybody's getting broken up into smaller and smaller camps, largely. And it's really hard to communicate over those lines. So if we just don't have the same set of truths or facts, then how are we even to go forward?
I think social media has done wonders in driving that kind of division forward, just giving us our own kind of worldview back to us through algorithmic dances.
Yeah. So we've got a few minutes left, and I'm kind of curious, like, where you would like to see people's attention go, like beyond the ecological. Like, is there kind of a topic and like the transpersonal or elsewhere that would be really cool to see people head towards and work on?
Well, I don't know. I feel like it's all interconnected, but definitely towards more kind of expansive views of reality, if I could say that. Like, when I think about, for example, like DMT entities, like what ontologically, what can they be? What are they? And I know there are many discussions that are going on in that sphere, but I'm just curious how these things can give us a more holistic worldview. And like, I think we've really lost our place, where is man or humankind and what is our role on this planet? And so, I don't know, I'm just very interested in the meaning-making aspect of these tools and how we can harness that for the benefit of like the individual, but also the planet.
Right. We're at a crisis of meaning in the world.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Kind of inarguable, right? So how do we go forward from here? Have happy, reasonable lives, possibly leave the place better than we found it. Yeah. And I would love to see people transitioning to this kind of First Nations concept. I forget which tribal group like kind of had this, but this idea of 7 generations, like how does my decision impact 7 generations downstream? And use that almost all the time with your decisions. I would love to see that. I don't know if that's possible.
Raising the question of how to become better ancestors.
Right.
And yeah, in this case, like, I don't think psychedelics are the only answer or are even the answer. But for me, like, I feel so passionate about them because they have been tools in turning me on to what I feel are greater parts of this reality. I feel like I'm somewhat of a perennialist. Like I kind of subscribe to like this view that Aldous Huxley pushed forward, the perennial philosophy, that all of these kind of mystical traditions and experiences kind of point back to the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Super funny. That word has kind of become a dirty word in some areas. And I'm trying to figure out why. Like, I know they have a systematic critique, but perennialism in particular. Like, I love perennialism, right? It's a really helpful framework. Yeah. I'll report back to you once I understand it better.
Okay.
I'm recording with one of those philosophers in a few weeks.
Okay. I've read an article by Andy Letcher. I forget the name of the article, where he, kind of argued against perennialism and spoke about how a specific psychedelic experience or a given psychedelic experience is a product of someone's, like an individual's given, like, enculturation, where we were raised, how we were raised, our own individual psyches, and that what we see is a product of that and not necessarily like something, that can be extrapolated and seen in other cultures. And if we do that thereafter, it's our like abilities to find patterns and things, etc., as opposed to, for example, maybe I have like an experience of what I later consider is Kundalini awakening or something like that. Is it really Kundalini awakening, or am I just putting that name on it?
Right.
It's hard to know.
Or are there different layers to it, right?
Yeah.
Like, is that just how the body works, and then the rest of it's like slightly different?
Mm-hmm.
Are they talking about very different things? Or like they developed the MEQ, the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, based on broad survey of what reports they saw from mystical experience out there. So I think it's a topic worth engaging in. This is definitely an interesting area. So I'm excited about that.
Yeah, me too.
Some religious traditions look just very opposite, but the perennial idea is just like, what happened to these yogis and those kind of random Christians and a few Jews and whoever else? Like, it's kind of similar. And what does that mean, that thousands of miles away, like they're coming up with similar material? And that's kind of the argument, I think. But let's see what we can come up with. Mm-hmm. All right. So we're at about an hour, Jasmine. I'm wondering if you want to shout anything out before we wrap here.
Yes. Well, related to my work for Synergetic Press, actually, I didn't really talk about the books that we're publishing. And one of them that I'm particularly excited about is called The Nature of Drugs. It is by Alexander Shulgin. It's a course that he taught at SFSU in the 1980s about pharmacology, drugs, and their social impact. And so that will be released this May, and I'm really excited about it. And also, we will be doing a 2-day symposium together with City Lights Bookstore in June 26th and 27th, I believe. It'll be free. It's an online event. And yeah, I'm excited about those two things.
Great. I'm going to try to beg my way into being involved. So
I'm sure we can navigate that. Yeah, I'm sure we can navigate that.
Cool. And it looks like so this is probably a few months out, so we can kind of mention it, that looks like we'll be doing a giveaway of that book as well.
Yes, exactly.
So stay tuned at Psychedelics Today and all our socials, and you'll learn all about that.
Great.
Yeah. All right. Well, Jasmine Virdi, it's been wonderful having you here. I can't wait to publish more of your work and hopefully have you on the show again in the future. All right. There you have it. Jasmine Virdi, writer for Psychedelics Today, works over at Synergetic Press and elsewhere. You can read full bio in the show notes here. So yeah, if you go to our website, psychedelicstoday.com/podcast, you can find this podcast episode and read all about Jasmine. Jasmine's been a great contributor over here. We can't wait to do even more work with Jasmine when hopefully she wraps her master's from the Aleph Trust, where David Luke is operating, which is really cool. Yeah, thank you, Jasmine, for joining us on the show. Really great having you here, finally. I hope we get the opportunity to do more. Maybe even have you on a Friday episode or two. Yeah. So thank you, Jasmine, for joining us. And thank you all for tuning in. If you want to support us, leave us a small monthly donation over at Patreon, patreon.com/Psychedelics Today, or check out our course offerings at psychedeliceducationcenter.com. And you can see what we're offering over there and see if anything speaks to you. We've got some great training for clinicians, some great Jungian courses, and much more. So I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next episode. It's Joe Moore signing off for Psychedelics Today. Bye-bye.